The text message arrived at 2:17 a.m. on a Friday morning, and even before I read it, I knew something unprecedented was happening. The sender was Dr. Patricia Williams, a longtime Democratic strategist who had worked on every major campaign since the 1990s and who had never, in all the years I'd known her, sent me anything that wasn't carefully considered and politically significant. Barack, you need to see what just happened with Fetterman. This isn't just another internal party disagreement. This is a complete breakdown of Democratic unity, and it's happening in real time on national television. The View situation has spiraled so far out of control that we're watching our own party implode on live TV. I immediately turned on my secure laptop and began searching for whatever footage had triggered Patricia's urgent message. What I found was more devastating than anything I could have imagined. Senator John Fetterman, someone who had been considered a reliable Democratic vote and a rising star within progressive circles, had essentially declared war on his own party during what was supposed to be a routine interview about the ongoing government shutdown. But this wasn't just about policy disagreements or strategic differences. This was about fundamental questions of political integrity, party loyalty, and what happens when political leaders decide they can no longer stomach the tactics their own organizations are using to maintain power. The government shutdown had been dragging on for 3 weeks, with both sides blaming each other for the impasse while millions of Americans watched their federal services disappear and their paychecks get delayed. Standard political theater, the kind of brinkmanship that has become routine in Washington over the past decade. Democrats were holding the line on certain spending priorities, Republicans were demanding concessions on others, and everyone was positioning themselves for maximum political advantage when the crisis finally resolved. But what Fetterman revealed during his appearance on The View changed everything. Because it wasn't just about the shutdown anymore, it was about what Democratic leadership had been doing behind the scenes to manipulate public opinion, exploit the crisis for political gain, and coordinate with media outlets in ways that completely undermined any pretense of honest democratic discourse. "My party went too far this time," Fetterman said, his voice carrying a level of anger and disgust that caught even the show's hosts off guard. "I can't sit here and pretend that what we're doing is about serving the American people when I know for a fact that leadership has been planning to extend this shutdown for maximum political damage, regardless of how much it hurts working families." The studio went silent. This wasn't supposed to happen. Politicians, especially Democratic politicians appearing on friendly shows like The View, don't break ranks this dramatically. They don't expose internal party strategies. They don't admit that their leadership might be more concerned with political positioning than public welfare. But Fetterman was just getting started. 3 days ago, I was in a strategy meeting where senior Democrats were literally celebrating the fact that the shutdown was hurting Trump's approval ratings in swing states. They were talking about extending it through the holidays, if necessary, to maximize the political damage. These are people who are supposed to represent working Americans, and they're treating a crisis that's devastating millions of families like it's some kind of political opportunity. The host tried to redirect the conversation to give Fetterman an opportunity to walk back his comments or clarify that he was talking about unnamed Republicans or external political operatives. But he doubled down in ways that made it clear this wasn't a slip of the tongue or an emotional outburst. This was a calculated decision to expose what he had witnessed from inside the Democratic leadership structure. "I've got recordings," he continued, and you could see the shock register on everyone's faces. "Voice memos from strategy calls where leadership is discussing how to coordinate with media outlets to make sure the shutdown gets blamed entirely on Republicans, even when we know that Democratic demands are just as responsible for the impasse. I've got emails showing how we've been feeding talking points to journalists who are supposed to be providing independent coverage." But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. "The View stunt," Fetterman said, referring to the show he was currently appearing on, "was planned weeks ago as part of a coordinated media strategy. I was supposed to come here and deliver specific talking points about Republican extremism and Democratic reasonableness. I was given a script, told which questions would be asked, and coached on how to respond in ways that would generate the most favorable coverage." The audience was stunned. The hosts looked like they had been caught in a conspiracy they didn't even know they were part of. This wasn't just a politician going rogue. This was someone exposing the systematic manipulation of media coverage by his own party on a show that was apparently part of that manipulation. "I can't do it anymore," Fetterman concluded. "I got into politics because I believed we could make a difference for working people. But what I've seen over the past few months has convinced me that both parties are more interested in political warfare than actual governance. My party talks a good game about representing the people, but behind closed doors, we're just as cynical and manipulative as anyone else in Washington." What happened next was unlike anything I'd ever seen in American politics. Instead of the usual damage control, spin campaigns, and attempts to minimize the political fallout, the Democratic Party's response to Fetterman's revelations was swift, brutal, and completely counterproductive. Within hours, Democratic leadership was attacking one of their own senators more aggressively than they had ever attacked most Republican opponents. Chuck Schumer's office released a statement questioning Fetterman's mental fitness and suggesting that his previous health issues might be affecting his judgment. Nancy Pelosi went on CNN to describe Fetterman as confused and possibly compromised by unknown influences. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who had previously supported Fetterman on progressive issues, posted a series of tweets suggesting that he had been captured by corporate interests and was betraying everything he claimed to stand for. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee announced they would be reassessing their support for any of Fetterman's future political activities. But the most devastating response came from The View itself. Instead of acknowledging the ethical questions raised by Fetterman's revelations about coordinated media manipulation, the show's producers released a statement claiming that Fetterman had violated the trust of our platform and had demonstrated a concerning disregard for honest political discourse. The irony was overwhelming. A politician was being attacked for exposing dishonest political discourse by the very people who had been participating in that dishonesty. The Democratic Party was proving Fetterman's point about their cynical manipulation by engaging in exactly the kind of character assassination and narrative control that he had criticized. But the most damaging aspect of the Democratic response was how it revealed the complete breakdown of any pretense that the party operated according to principles rather than pure political calculation. Instead of engaging with Fetterman's substantive criticisms about shutdown strategy and media manipulation, Democratic leaders chose to destroy his credibility through personal attacks that had nothing to do with the accuracy of his revelations. This wasn't how political parties are supposed to handle internal disagreements. When members raise legitimate concerns about party tactics or strategy, the response should be discussion, debate, and possibly policy changes. What happened to Fetterman was something entirely different. It was a coordinated campaign to destroy anyone who threatened to expose how the party actually operated behind the scenes. The recordings Fetterman referenced began appearing on social media platforms within days of his View appearance. Audio from Democratic strategy calls where senior party officials discussed extending the government shutdown for maximum political advantage. Email chains showing coordination with journalists who were supposed to be providing independent coverage of the crisis. Text messages revealing the extent to which media appearances were scripted and coordinated to create the illusion of spontaneous political commentary. The content of these leaks was devastating to the Democratic Party's credibility, but the response was even more damaging. Instead of acknowledging problems and committing to reform, party leadership doubled down on attacking Fetterman personally while completely ignoring the substantive issues he had raised. Senator Elizabeth Warren described the leaks as selective editing designed to damage Democratic unity. Chuck Schumer suggested that Fetterman might be working with foreign agents who wanted to undermine American democratic institutions. The Democratic National Committee released a statement claiming that the recordings had been taken out of context without explaining what context would make strategic discussions about exploiting a government shutdown for political gain acceptable. But perhaps the most revealing response came from the media outlets that had been identified in the leaked communications. Instead of investigating whether their coverage had been improperly influenced by Democratic talking points, most major news organizations chose to focus their reporting on Fetterman's motivations and mental state rather than the ethical questions raised by his revelations. The Washington Post ran a lengthy analysis of Fetterman's recent erratic behavior that included extensive quotes from anonymous Democratic officials questioning his reliability. CNN devoted multiple segments to discussing whether Fetterman's previous health issues might be affecting his political judgment. MSNBC brought on a parade of Democratic strategists to explain why his criticisms of party tactics were misguided and dangerous to democratic institutions. The pattern was clear and deeply disturbing. Instead of engaging with legitimate questions about media manipulation and political cynicism, the entire Democratic establishment had chosen to destroy the messenger while ignoring the message. They were proving Fetterman's point about their willingness to prioritize political advantage over honest discourse by engaging in exactly the kind of coordinated narrative control that he had criticized. But the most significant long-term damage was to Democratic credibility with their own base. Millions of Democratic voters had supported the party because they believed it represented a more honest, more principled approach to politics than what they saw from Republicans. Discovering that their own party was engaging in the same kind of cynical manipulation they had criticized in their opponents created a crisis of faith that extended far beyond normal political disappointments. Progressive activists who had volunteered for Democratic campaigns began questioning whether their efforts had actually supported authentic political change or it simply provided legitimacy for more sophisticated forms of political manipulation. Donors who had contributed money based on Democratic promises about transparency and accountability started demanding explanations for tactics that seemed to contradict everything the party claimed to represent. Young voters who had been attracted to Democratic politics because it seemed to offer alternatives to traditional Washington cynicism began reconsidering their political engagement entirely. If the Democrats were just as willing to exploit crises and manipulate media coverage as any other political organization, what was the point of maintaining party loyalty or continuing civic participation? The psychological impact extended beyond immediate political consequences. When people discover that political leaders they trusted are willing to exploit national crises for partisan advantage, when they learn that media coverage they relied on for accurate information has been systematically manipulated, when they realize that their own party views them as useful tools rather than citizens whose welfare matters, the result isn't just disappointment or anger. The result is the complete breakdown of the social trust that makes democratic participation possible. People stop believing that political engagement can produce positive changes through any conventional means. They become cynical about all political figures and institutions, not just the specific individuals who betrayed their trust. They withdraw from civic participation entirely, or worse, they become susceptible to authoritarian appeals that promise to destroy the entire system that has systematically exploited their idealism. What happened with Fetterman's revelations represents something more dangerous than typical political scandals or routine examples of partisan manipulation that have always existed in American politics. This represents the systematic weaponization of government crises for political advantage conducted in coordination with media outlets that are supposed to provide independent oversight of political institutions. The government shutdown wasn't just a policy disagreement that got out of hand. It was a deliberately prolonged crisis designed to generate political advantage for one party while inflicting maximum suffering on ordinary Americans whose welfare was considered secondary to partisan positioning. The media coverage wasn't just biased reporting that favored one side over another. It was coordinated propaganda designed to manipulate public opinion through false narratives about what was actually happening in Washington. The Democratic response to Fetterman's expose wasn't just damage control or spin designed to minimize political fallout. It was a comprehensive campaign to destroy anyone who threatened to reveal how the party actually operated when they thought no one was watching. These aren't isolated problems that can be addressed through leadership changes or institutional reforms. They represent fundamental challenges to the basic assumptions that make democratic governance possible. When political parties are willing to exploit national crises for partisan advantage, when media outlets abandon independent journalism in favor of coordinated propaganda, when party loyalty becomes more important than honest discourse about policy and strategy, democracy itself becomes impossible to sustain. The phone calls I received in the hours after Fetterman's appearance confirmed what I had suspected about the broader implications of what we had witnessed. This wasn't just about the Democratic Party's internal problems or one senator's decision to break ranks with his leadership. This was about the complete breakdown of the institutional norms and ethical constraints that had made American democratic governance possible for previous generations. Sources across the political spectrum were reporting similar tactics being used by Republican leadership, progressive organizations, conservative groups, and media outlets representing every point on the ideological spectrum. The Fetterman revelations had opened a window into systematic problems that extended far beyond any single party or political movement. The government shutdown that had triggered this crisis was just one example of how political leaders from both parties were willing to inflict suffering on ordinary Americans in pursuit of partisan advantage. The media manipulation that Fetterman had exposed was just one example of how supposedly independent journalism had been compromised by political actors who understood that controlling information flow was more effective than winning policy debates. The character assassination campaign directed against Fetterman was just one example of how political institutions would destroy anyone who threatened to expose their actual methods and priorities, regardless of whether those revelations served the public interest. We're witnessing the systematic transformation of American politics from a system based on democratic competition between different policy approaches into something that resembles warfare between competing propaganda operations, each trying to manipulate public opinion through coordinated campaigns of information control and narrative management. The rules that once governed political competition, basic honesty about policy positions, respect for institutional norms, commitment to public welfare over partisan advantage, have been abandoned in favor of techniques that prioritize victory over governance and political control over democratic accountability. Most Americans have no idea how fundamentally the nature of political competition has changed. They're still thinking about politics in terms of policy disagreements between candidates who represent different approaches to governance. They don't understand that they're living through the emergence of information warfare techniques designed to manipulate their political behavior while concealing the actual priorities and methods of the political leaders they're supposed to be choosing between. The Fetterman incident was just one example of what happens when these techniques are exposed, and the response reveals everything we need to know about how political power actually operates in contemporary America. Instead of engaging with legitimate criticisms about tactics and strategy, political institutions choose to destroy anyone who threatens their ability to operate without public oversight or accountability. The question isn't whether these methods will continue to be used. They've been proven effective, and the incentives for using them become stronger every election cycle as political competition becomes more intense and the stakes become higher. The question is whether enough Americans will recognize what's happening in time to demand changes that can preserve some meaningful form of democratic governance before information warfare completely replaces democratic debate as the primary method of political competition. Based on what I witnessed in the aftermath of Fetterman's revelations, I'm increasingly concerned that we may have already passed the point where traditional democratic responses can address problems that operate at this level of institutional sophistication and political coordination. But I continue to speak about these developments because people deserve to understand what they're actually facing when they participate in political processes, not the democracy they learned about in school or remember from previous generations, but the reality of political competition in an era where information control and narrative management have replaced policy debate as the primary tools of political combat. The morning after Fetterman's View appearance was the beginning of my education about how far American political institutions have moved away from anything that resembles democratic governance. And everything I've learned since then suggests that what we witnessed was just a preview of systematic changes that will make honest political discourse impossible to sustain in any mainstream political context. But the story didn't end with the immediate political fallout from Fetterman's revelations. In the weeks that followed, something even more disturbing began to emerge as the full scope of what he had exposed became clear to those of us with access to information that never makes it into public reporting. 3 days after his View appearance, I received a secure call from someone I can't identify, but whose position in the intelligence community gives them access to communications monitoring that most Americans don't know exists. What they told me about the Democratic Party's response to Fetterman's revelations revealed an operation that went far beyond typical political damage control. "Barack," the voice said, "they're not just trying to discredit Fetterman. They're conducting a comprehensive psychological warfare campaign designed to destroy anyone who might be tempted to follow his example. We're monitoring communications that show coordination between party leadership, media outlets, opposition, research firms, and what can only be described as professional character assassination specialists." The scope was breathtaking. Within 48 hours of Fetterman's appearance, Democratic operatives had compiled detailed psychological profiles of every Democratic senator who had ever expressed private doubts about party tactics. They had identified potential defection risks based on voting patterns, public statements, and private communications that had been gathered through methods that would have impressed intelligence agencies conducting operations against foreign adversaries. But the most chilling aspect was how they planned to preemptively neutralize anyone who might consider speaking out about what they had witnessed from inside the party structure. Each potential dissenter had been assigned a specific vulnerability portfolio, carefully researched personal, financial, or professional weaknesses that could be exploited if they ever decided to go public with criticisms of party leadership. Senator Joe Manchin, who had occasionally broken ranks with Democratic leadership on policy issues, had a file detailing his family's business relationships and potential conflicts of interest that could be exposed if he ever became too critical of party operations. Senator Kyrsten Sinema's portfolio focused on her personal relationships and lifestyle choices that could be used to damage her credibility with Democratic voters if she ever decided to reveal what she knew about behind-the-scenes party tactics. Even senators who had never shown any signs of disloyalty had been subjected to comprehensive background investigations that identified potential pressure points that could be used to ensure their continued cooperation. The message was clear: everyone was vulnerable, everyone was being monitored, and everyone understood the consequences of crossing party leadership. But the operation extended far beyond individual senators. Democratic operatives had identified journalists, academic researchers, think tank analysts, and even family members of political figures who might be in position to corroborate or expand on Fetterman's revelations. Each had been assessed for potential threats they might pose and strategies for neutralizing them if they became problematic. The journalist who had first reported on the leaked recordings found herself subjected to a comprehensive investigation of her personal finances, professional relationships, and family background. Stories began appearing in Democratic-friendly outlets questioning her journalistic ethics and suggesting that she might have financial motivations for pursuing stories damaging to the party. Sources who had previously been willing to provide information suddenly became unavailable, and her editors began expressing concerns about the balance of her reporting. Academic researchers who had begun analyzing the political implications of Fetterman's revelations discovered that their university funding was being questioned by major donors who happened to have close relationships with Democratic leadership. Conference invitations were withdrawn, research grants were reassessed, and collegial relationships were subtly damaged through whisper campaigns about their partisan bias and professional integrity. Think tank analysts who had written pieces exploring the broader significance of media manipulation in contemporary politics found themselves facing budget cuts, staff reductions, and pressure from board members to focus their research on more constructive topics that wouldn't damage democratic institutions during challenging political times. The systematic nature of these responses revealed something that went far beyond normal political opposition research or damage control. This was a comprehensive campaign to create a climate of fear that would prevent anyone with inside knowledge of party operations from considering whether they had moral or civic obligations to share that information with the public. The psychological impact on Democratic insiders was immediate and profound. Conversations that had previously been frank and honest became guarded and superficial. Staff members began assuming that their communications were being monitored and their loyalty was being evaluated based on criteria they couldn't fully understand. The spontaneous policy discussions and strategic debates that are essential to healthy political organizations were replaced by careful adherence to approved talking points and predetermined narratives. But perhaps the most disturbing development was how this climate of internal surveillance and intimidation began affecting the Democratic Party's ability to function as an effective political organization. When party members can't trust each other enough to have honest conversations about strategy and tactics, when every policy discussion becomes an exercise in demonstrating loyalty rather than exploring options, when innovation and critical thinking are viewed as potential threats to party unity, the result is an organization that becomes progressively more isolated from reality and less capable of adapting to changing circumstances. The government shutdown that had triggered Fetterman's initial revelations continued for another 2 weeks after his View appearance, but the Democratic Party's ability to develop coherent strategies for resolving the crisis had been severely compromised by their internal paranoia about potential defectors and whistleblowers. Instead of focusing on policy solutions or negotiating strategies, party leadership was devoting enormous resources to monitoring and controlling their own members. The final resolution of the shutdown, when it finally came, was a compromise that satisfied no one and demonstrated the complete breakdown of normal legislative processes. But by that point, public attention had largely moved on to other issues, and the systematic problems that Fetterman had exposed were buried under layers of partisan spin and media manipulation that made honest assessment almost impossible for ordinary citizens to undertake. The long-term implications of what we witnessed extend far beyond the immediate political damage to Democratic credibility or the personal destruction of one senator who tried to speak truth about what he had witnessed. We're looking at the emergence of political organizations that operate more like intelligence agencies conducting operations against their own members than like democratic institutions designed to represent citizen interests through open debate and honest competition. The techniques that were deployed against Fetterman and anyone who might support his revelations represent a fundamental transformation in how American political institutions maintain control and discipline. Instead of relying on shared principles, policy agreements, or even traditional forms of political pressure, they now use comprehensive surveillance, psychological manipulation, and systematic intimidation to ensure compliance with leadership directives. This isn't how democratic political parties are supposed to function. When organizations become more focused on controlling their own members than on serving the citizens they represent, when internal surveillance becomes more important than external communication, when loyalty tests become more significant than policy debates, we're no longer looking at institutions that can sustain democratic governance. The American people deserve to understand what their political parties have become and how far they have moved from anything that resembles the democratic institutions they were taught to respect and support. The Fetterman incident was just a window into operational realities that most citizens never see, but that determine how political power actually functions in contemporary America.